Yes, so Louise Ferguson is a UC Cooperative Extension Specialist and Pomologist. And today she is going to talk about canopy management in oil and table olives. Thank you, Louise.
So I'm going to talk primarily about mature canopy management in oil and table olives. I'd like to start by saying I'm the statewide extension specialist for table olives, which is what I've primarily worked with, though increasingly in recent years have become acquainted with oil olives. But I'd also like to credit several people with information for this presentation, including Michaela Nose, a technical officer at Cobram, and her colleagues, Rich Rosekrantz from CSU Chico, John Post, a private consultant, Miguel Calzada, Leandro Ravetti, and Chiriaco Chavez, who worked with her on some of the very recent information I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation that I saw at an olive meeting just last week. And also Bill Krieger, longtime farm advisor up in Glenn County, who assisted in the development of a lot of this information. The new statewide tree orchard management specialist, Julia Marino, and our project scientist, Emily Santos. And then we've received considerable help from Eric Nielsen, Incorporated, and Gold Coast Hose and Hydraulic in harvesting experiments. First question, can everybody see the presenter views on the side of my slide, or is that just me? Because I can't seem to get it to decrease.
I only see your main slide.
Okay, good. So I'm going to start off by telling you the trees grew just fine before we came along. There are only two reasons to prune a tree. And the first is harvestability. It doesn't matter how many gallons of oil or how many tons of table olives, this is a bin of table olives, you produce, if you can't get the fruit off the tree and into the bin. So for that reason, basically pruning is one of the primary reasons for pruning is to be able to efficiently harvest that tree. Just to give you an example of what we're dealing with in table olives, I will start off here with table olives and move to oil. Just to give you an example of what we're dealing with in traditional table olives, this is a traditional Manzanillo table olive tree. That's an 18-foot ladder. That fella has a 20-foot bucket, or excuse me, 20-pound bucket, and knit gloves on. And that's about the only way we can harvest these huge old trees with massive irregular trunks. On the other hand, we have had some plantings in recent years, trees under 30 to 35 years old, that we were able to prune, as you can see, to train with more of a clear trunk that might be amenable to trunk shaking. But the canopies are obviously too big for any kind of over-the-row harvesters, the harvesters that you people in the oil industry enjoy. And in even more recent years, we have started to take a lesson from the oil olive industry. This is a planting of about 200 trees to the acre, what we call moderate density, 12 by 18, raised on a 3-wire trellis to try and give us a narrower canopy. And when we developed this orchard, we were thinking both of trunk shaking and canopy, the kind of canopy contact technology, which we have recently been developing. So when we say trunk shaking, we're talking about the kind of shakers that were used in pistachios. This would be a pistachio shaker with the this from Gold Coast Hose and Hydraulics with the wider wings. They have a more wide angle on them. So we can use these on olive trees that don't have a large or irregular trunk, though we still do have problems with barking because a table olive tree is irrigated as closely as we can up to harvest because we want the size and the weight on the olive. In recent years, we have experimented with this canopy contact harvester. This is only a prototype, though we have released the specs. developed by Doctors Uriel Rosa, John Miles, and more recently, we have a very new form of it being tested by Dr. Riza Athani. This early prototype, what we focused on was just this canopy contact head. As I said, it's only a prototype. So we mounted it on a bobcat and basically drove it backwards because it's a prototype and doesn't have a catch frame. But this kind of harvester was amenable to harvesting a fruiting wall type orchard, which is why we are trying to develop moderate density orchards up to 200 trees to the acre in table olives. On the other hand, the oil industry, which has gone to high density and super high density orchards, the pruning can be managed to create hedgerows with fruiting walls that do not shade each other out as the day progresses. And you can use these bow rod harvesters or the oxbow type over the row harvesters that contain the same kind of technology that I showed you in this head, basically passively rotating heads in which the ends of these rods have about a 30-centimeter whip and whip against the edges of the branches and remove the fruit. So I'd like to just say that the first reason to manage a canopy is to facilitate mechanical harvesting. Dr. Yoav Zareg, the Dean of Mechanical Harvesting from Israel, has said there is no mechanical harvesting of tree crops without canopy modification. Okay. The second reason for pruning a tree crop is to produce annual marketable yields, to basically manage your cropping. This figure is from the California table olive production forecast versus final production for the last 9 to 10 years. And basically what it shows you is that olives do what's called alternate bearing. A high crop followed by a low crop sometimes takes two, sometimes it's rather muted, but as you can see in recent years, it has been both the forecast and the actual cropping have had a distinct, what we call alternate bearing pattern. High crops followed by low crops. Some research in other alternate bearing crops demonstrates that the biggest predictor in tree crops of the crop you're going to have the coming year is the crop you had the previous year. That's the total potential, then somewhat modified by your winter chilling temperatures, if chill is required, and your temperatures during bloom. Okay. So to understand the alternate bearing in olives and their production of sequential high and low yields, you need to understand both the vegetative growth habit of an olive and the fruiting growth habit of an olive. If left, the fruiting habit of an olive, where it bears its fruit. If left alone by itself, olives will strongly alternate bear. Just to give you an example, because trees in an orchard can differ from one another, whole orchards can differ from the statewide average, even individual trees within an orchard. And here's an example of it. Over here is a tree. See that upright growth? That means there's no olives on that tree. Otherwise, they would be locked over like this tree. Left to grow naturally, olives produce a fruiting shell of olives on the outer surface. So to understand the alternate bearing, first you have to understand the vegetative growth of an olive. Olives are what we call, when mature, are what we call apically dominant. Vegetative growth only grows from the tip of the shoot. There are very few lateral vegetative buds on a young olive shoot, particularly up to 3 years. And the olive's vegetative growth is thin, weeping shoots that lop over, like you saw on that previous picture in the tree, that form a shell over the tree canopy. So just as I pointed out here. So in essence, what you have is this very weepy growth habit with growth vegetative growth only from the tips of all of these shoots. There is very little branching on a current year's vegetative growth or up to 3 years old. It's only in the older wood where you start to see, where the sun hits the top of the wood, you start to see the branching. Just to explain how this happens, here's a little olive gotten from the nursery and placed out in the orchard, little shoot with 4 or 5 shoots. It's planted. What happens in the table olive industry is it's not trained like it is in the oil olive industry. Basically, we just want to get that tree up and bearing as soon as we can, because it takes really good 6 years to reach good bearing, maybe even 8. And so first the shoot is just allowed to grow, only clearing just like you do in the oil olive industry, clearing off or removing any shoots that would interfere with formation of a trunk. As this olive shoot grows and starts to get longer, it will lop over. Sunlight will hit the top of the shoot and encourage vegetative shoot growth and more vegetative shoot growth. So you can see how the vegetative growth habit of olives results in this naturally weeping pattern with the shaded interior of the tree, which is very non-productive. And the larger the shaded area, the more useless space you have on a tree. Generally, we say that olives need 50 to 60% of the leaves with full sunlight exposure to produce fruit, to produce a good economic yield. Okay. Also, to understand how alternate bearing develops, you need to understand the fruit bearing habit of olives. As I said, only the apical tip bud is vegetative, can produce new vegetative shoot growth. On that vegetative shoot growth, they have in the axils of the leaves, which rotate around the new shoot, meaning they're at right angles to one another successively, the fruit buds are in those leaf axils. They're called lateral fruit buds because they're on the sides of the shoot. And again, this creates that fruiting shell, because as the olives on the shoot mature, they have weight and they cause the shoots to lop over, creating again the dark interior of the tree. So basically, between the apically dominant vegetative habit of olives and the lateral fruit-bearing habit and the weight of the olives on the very light shoots causes the tree to naturally create a fruiting shell. In table olives and traditional trees, we used to say it was about 36 inches of a fruiting shell over the tree. The rest of the inside of that large tree I showed you was shaded and non-productive. Okay, now let's talk about how that leads into alternate bearing. All fruit trees alternate bear. They just have different mechanisms of how they alternate bear. You're going to get a really complete talk about this from Elizabeth Fichtner later in the session. But basically, the way olives alternate bear is either they don't produce significant shoot growth, or well, first I should start to say by alternate bearing in olives and in other apically dominant species in all species actually is a within an individual shoot phenomenon. That's where the actual alternate bearing occurs. There are different mechanisms of alternate bearing. The mechanism of alternate bearing in olives is either they don't produce sufficient shoot growth to have many buds, or the buds they produce do not fully differentiate into perfect flowers in the spring. That means a perfect flower is one that has male and female parts, a pistil and an anther and an embryo, and is therefore capable of producing a fruit. An imperfect olive flower only has the male parts, the anthers, does not have the embryo, and cannot produce a fruit. So And also Elizabeth is going to show you some more recent research that demonstrates perhaps the mechanism of alternate bearing in olives is a little bit like it is in pistachios. What pistachios do, they also produce their fruit buds the year before, but what happens is the fruit buds upsize from the shoot during the previous year, and therefore the new shoot growth has no fruit buds to produce fruit. We don't know the actual underlying physiological mechanism of alternate bearing, but it appears to be a function of the leaf to fruit ratio. How much carbohydrate, in especially the case of olives, where carbohydrates are stored primarily in the leaves and the proteins. If there is a very heavy ratio of fruit to leaf surface area, perhaps the production of the fruit when the year before the buds that are forming bloom, because the olives bear on 1-year-old shoot growth, perhaps the carbohydrate levels in those leaves and branches may generate a growth regulator signal that indicates to the growing shoot and to the olives that perhaps they should not grow so much shoot growth or should not differentiate as fully into perfect flowers. So we don't really know the biochemistry or the physiology of alternate bearing in olives, but we do know that following a heavy crop year on an individual shoot, the following year will have less fruit buds. The fruit buds may be imperfect or only male, and the fruit buds may upsize. But the result is within an individual shoot, as I said previously, crop load is determined by the previous year's crop load. An individual shoot will have less crop the following year. In pistachios, we found it is only responsive to pruning, because with pruning, certain kind of pruning cuts, we are able to generate a better balance of fruiting to non-fruiting shoots. As you saw in that previous slide, what eventually happens with alternate bearing species is the shoots on a tree start to synchronize, the trees in an orchard start to synchronize, the olives orchards in an area start to synchronize to the point that the crop even synchronizes statewide. The only thing that can really reset this synchrony is a major weather event that would destroy a crop. Okay, so I'm just going to go now into a little bit exactly how alternate bearing happens. So here's your little shoot this spring. The buds in these leaf axils that are right angles to one another, these fruiting buds are starting to form the olives in the leaf axils. Up here is your single vegetative bud that is going to have the shoot growth and the buds for next year's crop. So this is what we're going to start to see pretty soon in the spring, both bloom and set of the new olives and the beginning of shoot growth for the bearing surface for the next year. Okay. If you have a big, heavy crop like this, and generally with olives, you only need 0.5% of the olives on a tree to set to a good crop. But if you get these buds forming into nice, heavy fruit set within a single shoot, something that might look like this, what you're going to find is in shoots with heavy crop, you're going to get limited shoot growth and perhaps less functional buds in those axils. So and this will happen as the fruit on this 1-year-old shoot matures and the buds are being laid down in the axils of these leaves on the current year's growth, there appears to be a situation that either produces less shoot growth, less buds because they drop off, or less functional buds. So that's the actual mechanism of alternate bearing. We've worked with this extensively in pistachios, and the only thing that we have found that actually controls alternate bearing in pistachio is mechanical pruning, particularly topping, that spurs more vegetative growth with new bud surface, with new bud bearing area. So basically what pruning does is change the ratio of fruiting and non-fruiting shoots. It does not change the actual mechanism of alternate bearing. That still occurs. It just changes the percentage of fruits, of shoots that bear fruit versus the percentage of shoots that are strictly vegetative. Okay. Basically, I guess I cover this as the shoots synchronize, alternate bearing increases like you saw in that figure, and you prune to spur vegetative growth to balance the fruiting to non-fruiting shoots. The interesting thing in pistachios, in olives, currently the recommendation is to prune going into the heavy crop year. But what we found in pistachios is on certain rootstocks, the less vigorous ones, you should prune heavily going into the off crop year instead of the on crop year. One, because it reduces the crop that year by less. I mean, would you rather remove 60% of a 6,000 pound crop or 60% of a 1,000 pound crop is the logic. But now that we have more vigorous rootstocks that have better carbohydrate storage, we're finding that you can pruning before the on or the off year will decrease the alternate bearing. Okay. So now that you understand how the vegetative growth habit and the fruiting growth habit lead to the need for pruning, both to make sure the fruit gets into the bin, harvestability, and to decrease alternate bearing to produce regular annual crops, I'm going to go over briefly table olive canopy management, just to show you how we have approached trying to develop what you in the oil olive industry are so lucky to have, which is really effective mechanical harvesting. What you see right here is the whole reason that we are trying to develop the canopy management to make our trees suitable for mechanical harvesting. You know, basically, people like this are not only becoming less available. What I'm finding in the years I worked with olives, they're also less skilled, but mostly they are very expensive, even if we can get them. Some years, hand harvesting of table olive trees has reached 40 to 60% of the gross return of the gross on olives. That situation is not sustainable, considering particularly that the price for table olives per ton, $800 to $1,400 per ton for the sizes we want and the quality we want, has not changed significantly in the past 10 to 15 years. So as a result, the olive industry, which back in the 80s was about 40,000 acres and 17 processors, major processors, is now down to about 14,000 acres and 2 major processors. Those processors are very large. So we need to develop mechanical harvesting and develop managed canopies to do it, because the industry is not going to be sustainable with hand harvesting. Okay, so here's the traditional olive tree in California, planted at 96 to 136 trees per acre. To basically hand prune this tree would be a ladder and lopper operation with only thin cuts at the insertion of a branch to try and lower that tree height and to try and thin that canopy to increase light into the canopy. It would take over 2 years, approximately heavier pruning 1 year and a lighter pruning 1 year. Hand pruning would take approximately 25 hours per acre, 25 hours per acre at current rates. Okay, so what we're currently recommending with trees like this is rejuvenation pruning mechanically, so that we can adapt it for a canopy contact harvester, because there is no getting a trunk shaking harvester around that trunk. It's too irregular and it's too large. Okay, so this is what we did down at Rocky Hill Ranch in Visalia with Elizabeth Fichtner. We basically decided we were going to just reduce the size of these trees by about 60%. So we topped here mechanically at 12 feet. I really like these Kimball Star pruners because one of the things, these blades rotate like this and rotate like this. But the good thing is it throws the branches off the top of the tree. You have less necessity to go in with hooks and pull branches off the top of the tree. But we basically lowered those trees to 11 to 12 feet. These were trees planted 139 trees to the acre. And then we went in, used the same pruner because it can be adaptive. And in this case, we pruned both sides of the tree, though I don't recommend that in a standard management program. And we pruned about 4 to 6 feet from the trunk, depending upon the alley width. Our major restraint was trying to get the harvester down the row. So I'll just recap the data. The 5 years that we did this, the trees were planted at 13 by 26, 139 trees to the acre. As I said, we could not use trunk shaking harvesters. We had to use the Canopy contact harvester, which I much prefer for table olives anyhow, once we worked out how to decrease the bruising, and our California black-ripe processing hides a little bit of the bruising. So basically, this is the situation. The trees are too irregular for trunk shaking harvesters, and they are crotched too low for the trunk shaking harvesters, resulting in the kind of damage you see here. Okay. So what we used was our prototype Canopy contact harvester, which was actually a modified Jatropha harvester. As I said, we just mounted it on a bobcat for power takeout. It has these rings of rods rotate freely from one another, each independently, and they rotate only passively. As the rods engage the tree and the harvester moves backwards, these rods move passively from contact with the branches of the tree. And there's about a 30-centimeter whip at the end of these branches. And that's what removes the olives. And as I said, this was a prototype, and actually it's a front end loader, as you can see. We had to drive backwards so we didn't smash the olives because we didn't have a catch ring. Dr. Riza Esani of UC Merced is now developing he brought a modified citrus harvester from Florida that he's modifying that also has this same removal type head, but also has a catch frame on it. We're currently testing that. Okay, so basically over the 5 years, go back. The 5 years we did this trial, here's the control tree, and here's the trees that we reduced in size. You can see that even by removing almost 60% of the canopy, we only reduced the yield by about 0.9 tons, by about 15%. And when we use the Canopy contact harvester, we got 92% efficiency. That means 92% of the fruit that was on the tree made it into the bin versus about 81% efficiency for the Canopy contact harvester on the traditionally hand pruned trees that we did not mechanically prune. Basically, when we did a cost analysis, this meant that one, the harvester was equally as cost effective and even a slightly better than hand harvesting without all the logistics of having to manage a crew. So this is what we're trying to do with the old, more widely spaced 96 to 136 9 trees to the acre traditional orchards. Then we have some younger orchards that, as I pointed out, have good enough trunks or trunks that a Canopy contact, a shaker harvester can a shaker harvester can harvest. These are generally like 180 trees to the acre. And all we had to do for modification on these trees was, again, with mechanical pruning and hand pruning, first with hand pruning, we removed any scaffolds that did not have a good upright 45-degree angle, or that might interfere with clamping the harvester head. These were major, large cuts with a saw. Then we followed through with biennial, sometimes triennial hedging of the tree 2 to 4 feet from the trunk, and topping of the tree anywhere from 10 to 13 feet. Topping was an annual operation, because what we find with table olives is we don't like tending toward purple fruit. The fruit at the top tended to ripen earlier. The mechanical harvesting is indiscriminate and meant we got more color in the bin that degraded the price, or degraded the quality of the fruit. So we maintained orchards like this with a double-sided hedging every other row, every other year. That meant there were less passes, and an annual topping to decrease the amount of purple fruit, and to maintain the height that the canopy contact head could reach, because canopy contact head only had an area of about 6 feet, and the trees were skirted to clear the trunk for the petals of the harvester on the double-sided canopy contact harvester. This is the kind of harvester that we used. Basically, just to give you an idea of what this cost us, to adapt those trees cost about $1,000 an acre initially. The harvester, this is Eric Nielsen Enterprises harvester, when he first started, it was like 30 to 40 seconds per tree, equaling 90 to 129 trees the hour. Interestingly, as the harvester operator worked, he got more efficient and could do more trees per hour. So we were getting about 2 tons to the hour, with about 77% efficiency of removal. The trunk shaking removal efficiency with a willowy tree like an olive, where the branches in that fruiting wall can damp one another because of their flexibility. We simply can't get much higher than this efficiency. In orchards that had a really good crop, 5 to 7 tons, sometimes it was worth it to send in a hand harvest crew afterwards, because they could work from the ground, didn't need ladders. And because one of the interesting things about trunk shaking is the olives that don't harvest tend to be clumped in areas, so the pickers could move much more quickly. And this was especially true down on the skirts of the tree, which I will show you why in the next couple slides. Okay. The last method we're trying, as we're getting closer and closer to the oil industry, is we have new orchards. This is an orchard that Bill Krieger, retired farm advisor emeritus up in Glenn County, and I established. I believe it's now close to 20 years old, at 200 trees to the acre. About it was 12 by 18 was our 12 feet in the row, 18 between the rows. And what we did was put up a 3-wire trellis, where we did some that were just raised normally. We did some that were tied to the trellis. And then we came up with weaving the branches through the trellis, so we didn't have to bother with tying, but the tree stayed more upright. We were raising these trees for both a trunk shaker and a canopy contact shaker. We wanted basically a clear trunk for the trunk shaker and a fruiting wall for the canopy contact shaker. We're trying to maintain these trees at basically no higher than 12 feet, which means an annual topping at about 10 feet, no wider than 6 feet, which means a biennial hedging every other year at about 2 feet, and a skirting up at about 4 feet, followed by hand thinning. What we were shooting for was this kind of canopy as you stood in the row perpendicular to the tree and looked at it. We were looking for a palmate canopy with upright shoots. Oh, excuse me. This is also Manzanillo olive, which has a fairly vigorous growth habit compared to oil olives. Okay, so we're shooting for a palmate shape that has a fruiting wall and good light penetration. You know what the Spaniards say about pruning is you should prune your olive trees so that you can throw a cat through them. So we were looking for things that had good light penetration throughout the canopy, but produced a fruiting wall. What we find is the only way to get that light penetration through the canopy is with 4 to 6 hand cuts within the canopy, lopper cuts, thinning cuts in the canopy by hand with loppers. And also we wanted to remove any branches that extended out and interconnected with the harvester bed, because those olives wouldn't be harvested or interfered with the harvester. Okay. We used this type of, again, the Pistachio Shaker, though this one looks like it has almost higher wings. Now, what you need to know about trunk shaking is it transmits very well vertically, less well this way, and extremely poorly on the weeping shoots. What'll happen is that these shoots, especially the ones lower in the tree, if they have fruit on them, will just start to kind of hula back and forth. And with trunk shaking, if it doesn't come off within the first 2 seconds, it's not coming off. This is the kind of what we're trying to do to facilitate this harvesting, is develop a better abscission agent, an agent that a chemical spray that that facilitates earlier development of the fruit abscission zone, to make harvesting easier, to make it need less trunk shaking force. Because the problem with table olives is we harvest them physiologically immature. Unlike oil olives, a table olive requires about 1.5 pounds of pull force to pull that olive off the tree. If we could decrease that to 1/3 of that, then we would have better luck with our mechanical harvesting. On the other hand, oil olives, the removal force is probably 1/5 to 1/10 of what it is for a table olive. Okay. And we also use this harvester on the olives, again, the same way, no catch frame, so driving it backwards. But we designed this orchard, what we call a moderate density orchard, for both canopy contact and trunk shaking harvesters. The problem with getting this canopy contact harvester developed, we have released these specs. Anybody can take these specs and build one of these heads, but we've had no luck getting commercial fabrication of this head, which is usually the stopping point in all mechanical harvesting development programs, because fabricators only want to develop a machine that they can sell volumes of, and we only have 10 to 14,000 acres, so they're not interested in developing it. One other thing about this machine is the canopy, just like the canopies of oil olives, removal is better if the canopy is compressed. So this machine is designed to be operated from both sides of the canopy. So there would be a set of these machines moving in parallel. Okay. The cost to manufacture one of these, at last estimate, I took it to a fabricator, for one of these heads would be about $50,000. So a small grower could fabricate the head, mount it on a bobcat with sufficient power takeoff, or better yet, a rented bobcat, so you know it works, and probably recoup his costs within 2 or 3 years, depending upon the size of his orchard. Okay. So I'm just going to summarize pruning and how we're recommending in table olive orchards now. We top annually in the late winter after rains, because we want to decrease the spread of olive knots. So we do it in late winter, early spring. This should be 10, not 1. You top 10 to 13 feet from the ground, depending upon the harvest method you want and spacing. hedge one side late winter annually after the rains. The way we usually do this is use a double-sided hedger and go down and do the east and west sides of a row at the same time, 2 to 4 feet from the trunk, depending upon space, and about a 7 to 10% slant from the top of the tree, kind of a Christmas tree shape. We skirt annually at 4 feet, again after the rains, and then follow with hand pruning with loppers, thinning cuts for light penetration or any branches that would connect with the shaker head. So that's how we would prune, a program for trying to prune table olives for mechanical harvesting. Our progress summary: the trunk shaker is given us 77% efficiency with marketable olives. That means that they don't have damage. And our machine is commercially available. So that's what's being used by the people who do trunk shake. The Canopy contact harvester, great efficiency, 80 to 92% efficiency. But the machine, and it produces marketable olives. We've gone through both the receiving station grades and the processed olives, and consumers, both a consumer panel, sensory panel, and a trained sensory panel could not tell the difference between mechanically harvested and hand harvested olives. Okay, so this is where we're stuck right now. We do not have the Canopy contact machine, but we have enough evidence to know that you can profitably, economically feasible harvest with a trunk shaker if you have the canopy prepared, and probably if you get over 5 to 7 tons we want, you can follow up with a hand harvest crew. Okay, now we're going to talk about olive oil canopy management. And olive oil canopy management, first I'd like to say most of the information in this talk has come from the chapter written by Bill Krieger, of retired farm advisor in Glenn County, and Rich Rosekrantz, professor of horticulture at CSU Chico, in the new olive production manual that is now in layout at UCCE Press. And a lot of the information in it is based on research on how to model olive oil canopy management from a gentleman named Dennis Connors and his colleagues. So olive oil canopy management basically sectors into 2 areas: medium to high density. This is 150 to 300 trees to the acre. That can be, a trunk shaker can be used, or depending upon the height, the over-the-row canopy contact harvesters that either use the bow rods, like that, I think it was a Browd machine I showed you, or the oxbow machines that use the technology similar to the canopy contact, our prototype canopy contact. Then there's the super high density orchards, 500 to 900 trees to the acre. These are exclusively over-the-row harvesters, due to the fact that you couldn't get a trunk shaker in to that density, because the trunk shaker beds are too long and probably the trunks are too small. In both cases, these orchards are mechanically hedged, topped, and skirted. And increasingly, what we're going to talk about, though the actual production practices haven't been developed, it's becoming obvious that you need hand thinning cuts for light penetration. Okay, so this is an example of the kind of machine that is a Browd, I believe, with the bow rods that's used for harvesting mechanically, and also the canopy contact machine with a similar head to what I showed you earlier. Now, there's some points that must be remembered when you're managing the canopy of high and super high density olive orchards. First, the rows, for the data we have developed, the rows must be oriented north-south, because the reason for this is the sunrise, because of the canopies are now vertical. Unlike other fruit trees, it isn't the top of your rounded canopy that produces the major part of your fruit. It's the vertical sides of your canopy. To get maximum light on the vertical sides of those canopies, as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, it illuminates the east and west sides of the canopy maximally. Also, I would like to say that most of the data that has been developed for canopy management in oil olives was done at the 30 to 40 degrees north latitude, which luckily we fall in. The aim of canopy management in oil olive orchards is to have 50 to 60% of the leaves exposed to full sun. The hedging and topping timings are slightly different than in table olives. For oil olives, you would do your hedging in your alternate side hedging, or some people do it every year. You're hedging in the late spring, again, after danger of rains have passed, so that the danger of olive knot, particularly with Arbusana, is not as severe, though still in the spring, it's all wise to follow up with a prophylactic copper spray, which I forgot to say in table olives, we also do. Topping, hedging, this hedging spurs a greater vegetative response because it is done in the late winter or early spring. Late winter and early spring prunings produce a stronger response, even in evergreen trees like an olive. However, the topping is done in early summer because it doesn't spur as much of a vegetative response. And it's also done early, or maybe midsummer, to ensure that to ensure the tree height is suitable for a canopy contact harvester. You want to do your hedging and topping based on the data we have now annually, because heading cuts into wood more than 1/4 of an inch in diameter will strongly decrease return bloom. This is data that was developed by Dr. Richard Rosenkrantz of CSU Chico in the previous years. I'm going to show you a model that shows you the best yield and quality in canopies occurs when the depth of the canopy, that's from the top of the canopy to the bottom of the canopy, and I'll show you this graphically, is 1 to 2 times the free alley width. The free alley is the space in the alley that when the sun is at high noon is in sun, not canopy that is underneath, or not ground that is underneath the canopy. And what recent research has shown is that the high density yields are best with a 5 to 15% slope from the top of the canopy to the bottom. I can show you these graphically. Let's start with the cultivars that are currently used. For super high density, the 3 most common in California are Arbequina, Arbusana, and Koroniki. The reason these trees are suitable for suitable for olive oil production in hedgerows is because of the way the tree is formed. They have multiple small branches with numerous fruit buds, which means we'll get high yield early. They're precocious, which means we get high yields early, always good in orchard. They have thus far produced fairly consistent yields if pruned properly, and they have low vegetative vigor and compact growth, which makes them suitable for the mechanical harvesters that we use. The oil olive industry was so lucky in that there were grape harvesters, berry harvesters, coffee harvesters out there that you could adapt for olive oil, unlike the pistachio industry, unlike the table olive industry, which is still struggling with developing the pistachio and prune harvesters. I'd like to note of these 3 cultivars, this is by far the one most planted. Arbusana is not good in colder, wetter areas. We've had problems with olive knot. For high density plantings, you can use multiple other cultivars, including Manzanillo, because of their larger size and higher vigor. They can still be managed, as we demonstrated in that 200 tree to the acre row. They can still be managed for a canopy, for a side-by-side trunk shaking harvester or a canopy contact harvester that does not have to go over the row. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the difference between these cultivars and why they're suitable for olive oil production. Arbequina, Arbesana, and other varieties have a thinner trunk and multiple fruiting branches, thin little fruiting branches with lots of fruiting positions. The buds are in the axils of these leaves, versus trees like the Mission or the Manzanillo, which have thicker trunks, less frequent branching, less dissected branching, and less fruit-bearing positions. In other words, the tree is just too big and too vigorous and produces too much wood to be suitable for over-the-row mechanical harvesting. This is how the actual tree would look. Over here, we have one of our standard high-density cultivars. This is probably Manzanillo or Mission. And here we have one of the cultivars suitable for mechanical harvesting. And you can see it's got a lot more frequent branches. They're a lot thicker and have a lot more fruiting positions. So to begin with, if you're going to plant oil olives right now in California, we have our most experience with those three, though there are numerous new cultivars coming out of the breeding programs in Spain, all with the same aim. Basically, suitability for mechanical harvesting, high early yields, low vigor, compact growth, suitable to maintain the tree for mechanical harvesting. This is how the recommendations that we have for developing high density orchards developed. This is the model for, high density and super high density. This is the data that the row spacings and tree heights were developed on. I want to indicate that this model, most of this data was developed in the 30 to 40 degrees north latitude, and it is developed only for orchards on a north-south axis. This data is not functional for orchards developed on an east-west axis. So going through this drawing, basically, this is your row width, trunk to trunk. This is your tree width, bottom of the canopy to bottom of the canopy. This is your tree, what they call tree depth, which is the total top height of the tree minus the depth allotted, or minus the distance allotted to the trunk. And this is what's called your free alley width, the portion of the alley that is free to the sun, not in shadow at high noon. Basically, to summarize Connor's very extensive data, the highest yields and quality have been obtained when the canopy depth is equal to the alley width, when this is equal to this. Now, obviously, it's not what we see in this example, because they have also discovered that twice the alley width, 2 times this, if it equals the canopy depth, you do get higher yields, but the fruit lower in the canopy is of lesser quality. So at this point in time, basically, they're recommending that the canopy height in an orchard be maintained at no more than 1 to 2 times the alley width. Okay? And that placing a slope on the canopy will also increase the yield, and I'll show you why. This is data also developed by Dr. Connors. And what he did here was we have the free alley width on the bottom in feet, and we have the olive yield in gallons per acre. He compared a canopy with a depth of 6 feet. So that canopy probably was 10 feet tall if you gave it 4 feet, or 10 to 12 feet tall if you gave it 4 feet below for the trunk. The canopy width was 3 feet. And with this configuration, as the free alley width increased, what you can see is this configuration had the best, along with one other treatment, early yields, but as the canopy width, as the free alley width increased, the yields decreased. And this is simply because there were less feet of fruiting wall as the free alley width increased per unit of land. You literally had less rows of fruit because the alley width increased. Then he compared two canopies that had a depth of 12 feet. So the trees might have been as high as 14 to 15 feet because you had to get the canopy contact harvester on them. The canopy width in both cases was 9 feet wide, except on this second treatment, he put a 10-degree slope from the top to the bottom of the pruning of the canopy. And what you can see here is here is the orchard without the slope. And remember, these are both equally sized and have equally alley widths. And here is the orchard with the 10-degree slope on the top of the tree. And what you can see is increasing that slope. I'm going to go back one slide. Increasing that slope increased the amount of sunlight that hit the adjacent canopy. So basically, what this sloping canopy, what putting in this sloping cut did was basically increase the 10 to 15%, increase the illuminated area of the canopy and allowed for a closer row interval to increase the length of the fruiting wall. So basically, without changing the spacing, we got more light on the adjacent canopy and higher yields. So I encourage you to possibly work with this in your orchard. You could do one of the things that Dr. Rosenkrantz did was he put a time-lapse camera out there and got a view of the sunlight exposure of the canopy in the adjacent row. Okay. So with mature canopy management, your goal is, of course, high harvest efficiency. And we in the table oil industry or the table olive industry are very jealous of the harvest efficiencies you get with your harvesters appearing to be 95% and above. To decrease alternate bearing by reducing the current fruit crop load with either mechanical or hand pruning, and increase the vegetative growth, which will primarily come from the hedging treatments. Now you have two tools to do this with, heading and thinning cuts. Okay. And I'm just going to go through the difference between the heading and thinning cut. Here's a heading cut. That basically takes off the tip of a branch. Only the tip of a branch is removed. What a heading cut does is spur growth near the cut. So basically, when you do a heading cut, you're going to get your growth up here. When you do a thinning cut, where you go back, a thinning cut is where you remove something at the insertion on a branch. In other words, you remove the whole shoot. What that does is it distributes the growth response among the remaining shoots. Thinning cut is good for size control and minimizing excess growth. A heading cut is good for spurring vegetative growth. Now, horticulturally, I have to tell you that a mixture of the two, but especially thinning cuts for the tree, especially apically dominant trees, because in apically dominant trees, remember, only that single tip bud is vegetative. You have to really do a hard cut to spur a latent bud in older wood. And as we've seen, obviously, this is what mechanical pruning machines do. This is what you can do by hand. So horticulturally, the heading cut for a tree like an olive is horticulturally, it doesn't make sense. but it is so inexpensive for controlling tree size and spurring vegetative growth. And of course, we all know how hard it is to train somebody to prune an olive tree anyhow, because it has leaves all over it. Mechanical pruning has become the standard industry practice. What I think needs, and I'm going to show you some data pretty quick, what I think needs to be more developed is the application of thinning cuts, primarily to introduce more light into the canopy and perhaps to ensure that there's no interference with the harvester that you're using. So just like in pistachios, where we have developed mechanical pruning, horticulturally, the heading cut is all wrong, but it achieves the purpose of controlling the tree size and decreasing the pruning costs. And as a result, is still a functional thing to do, but it's beginning to appear that we need to start using thinning cuts to get that light into the canopy, because these heading cuts are spurring that proliferation of vegetative growth that shades the canopy, makes the interior of the tree non-productive, and encourages olive fly it's the dark canopy is good for olive fly as well as black scale, right, Cindy?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
We're actually a little over time at this point. I don't know where you're at.
I think I'm going to show them just one or two things. I didn't even think I had enough slides to talk that long. Okay, so mature canopy. Thank you, Cindy. Mature canopy management, years 1 to 3, train that tree to a hedge. You train it up a bamboo trellis. By year 2, you're mechanically tipping in early spring. By year 3, you're mechanically skirting, topping, and hedging in late winter to early spring. And by year 4, you're adding a summer 8 to 9 foot topping. Now, I'm going to show you some data. This is from Michaela Gnos, the technical officer, and her colleagues at Cobram. They've been noticing that across the state, these 10-year-old olive trees are declining in yield, alternate bearing is increasing, and they're getting, interestingly, declining harvest efficiency and more material other than olives in the bin. So this suggests canopy management practices need to be looked at. Here's what they did in a statewide survey. On the bottom here is we have the year of productivity olives. They analyzed over 1,000 acres of Arbequina and 200 acres of Arbosana. Over here we have olive oil yield. What her average curves show is about year 6, alternate bearing really starts to kick in and yields are decreasing. And then when they go out and look at these orchards, they're seeing bare lower canopies and a proliferation of growth at the top of the tree. She compared this to a colleague's orchard. Cobram works with Boundary Bend in Leandro Ravetti in Australia. And there they seem, in this analysis of almost 1,500 acres of Arbequina and 200 of Arbosana, that they got up to their peak at year 10, and they started alternate bearing then, but they didn't have anywhere near the sharp declines in yield, and the trees look more uniform. Please notice that's a wider alley. Also, these trees are at a wider spacing. There are 157 trees to the acre on that Arbosana. I don't know what is in the Arbequina. When she compared the years of productivity versus the gallons of oil, this orchard in Australia seems to be maintaining itself after hitting its peak, whereas these in California are declining. And they're getting a lot more in the bin here, material other than olives. They have set up an experiment to examine this phenomena. It's only in its first year, so I'm not going to show you any of the data, because when you work with yield and alternate bearing in olives, you should do at least 6 years before you start to talk about the data. But the implications of this observation are there's a problem with light interception and penetration in those vertical canopies in the high density versus super high density, indicating that perhaps high density might be a better option than super high density, easier to control. and that perhaps people had better start incorporating hand thinning cuts in the spring. And I'm finished. And again, I would like to acknowledge all the people whose data went into developing this talk. And I guess I'll stay around and break for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.